Welcome to Gray Maybe, a limited series podcast and social experiment based on this season's topic, grief. My name is Jillian Schmitz. I'm a professional dancer, actor, teacher, author, artist, and cat lover. Through my own personal journey of recovery, I found that things aren't just black or white, or a simple yes or no. For me, in my recovery, there has been mostly gray area and a lot of maybes. In most of my stories, you can find the gray maybe. I'll be sharing my own process through personal stories and interviews with others in an effort to help investigate the process of and recovery through grief. If you'd like to share your story, please email graymaybestories@gmail.com. graymaybestories@gmail.com. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're using to catch future episodes of Gray Maybe. A note before we start. My stories and the stories of others on this podcast are told through the lens of our own experience. The revelation of our process is ours to tell. If you disagree with the views or stories on this podcast, know that we are not speaking on anything other than our own experiences and viewpoints. Take what you like and leave the rest. Nothing expressed or mentioned in this podcast is an endorsement or is meant to be taken as advice. It is strictly the sharing of our own experiences and recovery. Any feelings this podcast activates in the listener is for the listener to process and recover from. Any criticism you have based on these experiences and choices are yours, and they are not anyone else's burden to carry. Trigger warning: death, brain cancer, sudden death. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Gray Maybe podcast. If you're just tuning in, thank you so much for deciding to do so. If you are an avid listener, I thank you even more for coming back again and again and again. Today's episode for this season is someone who I have had on the podcast previous, and so this will be her second time on the podcast. I love that she has more than one theme to come and discuss because I have many more than one themes to discuss, as many of us do. So I'm happy to have her back. This person is a clinical health education and wellness. She is in that field, or has been in that field. She is also into voiceover and does a lot of things with voiceover, is working towards voiceover work. She's also a fellow dancer and performer. So I would like to welcome back Miss Melissa Adylia Calasanz to the Gray Maybe podcast.
Hello, Miss Jillian. It's so good to see you again. Hey.
I'm so happy to have you back. You were one of the first people I thought about when deciding to do this this season, because when we were working out your first season on the podcast regarding the food season, I know that you were going through a very, very intense loss of your brother, and it actually kind of dictated how and when and where we did things, which I was happy to accommodate. So I know that you were going through that at that moment. But first, is there anything you'd like to add to my kind of disjointed intro? I was like hopping around. I'm like, she's many things. I want to kind of bullet point all of them, but I know you can kind of speak more in detail of what those are and what you want the people to know today.
Thanks, Jillian. I have to say thank you for the last time we were together because I had not had to introduce myself with just random audience. I usually know exactly who my audience is, and when you told me to introduce myself, I'm like, I wear so many hats. Like, who am I? What am I? And I always try to tell people, you're more than what you do professionally. And I was like, what am I? And so I started to think about that. And like, first and foremost, before my profession or anything, I'd like to say that I am a creative, compassionate, and curious, collaborative human being. And that winds up helping me and informing me with whatever I do professionally and interpersonally. So Excuse me, right before the new year, well, actually, right before my brother started to decline, getting sick, I had really committed to coming back to the entertainment industry. Since I am a SAG-AFTRA dancer over 50, I was coming back into that. And what brought me back in there was people trying to get me into voiceover work with my narration, my meditations, and corporate and healthcare education. And so that's what I was starting to pursue before my brother was diagnosed with terminal and inoperable aggressive cancer. And so I put that on hold. So even though, like professionally, I would like to still say I'm a SAG-AFTRA dancer over 50, a performance artist, a voiceover talent, all that stuff, I still hold close my what they say quote unquote grown up job is. And I am a clinical health and wellness educator, a C-IAYT certified yoga therapist with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I love to say that movement is medicine and we should prescribe wisely, whether we are dance educators or health and wellness educators. People tell me that I am their mentor. They say I'm a great writer. And
Yes, I wanted to bring that up. That's one thing I didn't write on my notes, but I wanted to is you're a fantastic writer. I love your poetry. I love the things that you've written that you just even post on social media that I glimpse. Absolutely, yes to that.
thank you for that because that is what I've been spending my time really focusing on since my brother passed, actually, is the poetry and the writing. I've been doing some really great intensives. I'm even taking another college course in poetry because people have been telling me you need to publish your poetry. And talking to our chaplain and interdisciplinary care team that I used to work with at a large healthcare group, a lot of the poetry that you have read were actually these really wonderful exercises or contemplations that I would leave as little notes with the floral arrangements I'd leave in our spiritual wellness room at the hospital. And they were very small little, poetic verses that I would leave that left space for contemplation and conversation. And so when our chaplain and our other patient experience team members would talk, we would talk about what these little snippets would mean to them. So what I'm hoping to do is put together a book of this poetry and use it not just as something to read because it can be just enjoyed by anyone, but also as a tool for conversation, whether taking narrative medicine out of the clinical setting and using it for the general public. So we can have conversations about the universal cycles of life, about collaboration, about community and communion from any lens, whether it be any age, race, gender, cultural lens, or anything. So that's what I'm hoping to do. That's what I'm working on right now during my downtime.
You absolutely should do that. It is not difficult to self-publish a book. I know a little bit about that. So if you ever want to discuss that in the future, because I think this is a really, 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 really great idea. I've noticed that for me, anyways, when I'm going through something difficult, I usually go through a phase of extreme research. And by research, I mean I'm Googling. Let's be real. I'm not a real researcher. I'm not like, dissecting data. What I'm doing is I'm like Googling everything I can find, looking at books, Audible. Like I'm just going through and trying to find resources to help myself through whatever it is I'm dealing with. And when it comes to grief, I think a lot of people do that. I think they reach out for solution. And I don't know if there is a ton of solutions. I'm still looking and working and finding what that is. But I think that as we've talked about a bit on the season so far, is that no one's going to escape grief. Sorry to break it to everyone who's listening, unless you are faced with the misfortune of dying so young, because aging is a privilege, you are going to have to deal with grief. And I guess you don't have to. You could avoid it, you could dodge it. I don't know what kind of repercussions that will cause for you down the road, physically, emotionally, spiritually, etc. But you will have to come face to face with it. And I know we don't like that fact. I know that's why we avoid it. I know that's why it's so hard to watch someone grieve, to talk to someone who's grieving, to know that someone has had to undergo some kind of a grief. But I think things like that, like what you're talking about, that could give someone a type of uh, manual, and not a manual of how to, but like a manual of like bringing some peace, right? I think that's what we all seek in.
Structure and stability, because that's the thing.
Yes.
See, that was the hardest thing. I know that anytime somebody wants to find a grief group, the only things that seem to be funded or available to the general public are specifics to cancer or to the death of a spouse. And then you might find one to child or maybe drug overdose. And the reason is that those are being funded by people who have the tenacity to get through, grant writing and funding like that. And there's no drop-in classes or drop-in groups anywhere. I mean, I couldn't find any because even though I knew how to hold space for others through their grieving process before mine started to happen, I couldn't find those resources for myself except through very strange avenues, but we can talk about that later. So,
I find that also very curious that not only as someone like you who is very seeking oriented couldn't find it, but also you have been a part of what I would call Western medicine, even though you are doing things that are more alternative. You were at one point in that system. So for you to not be able to find it means it doesn't exist
they make
very
it
easily.
so challenging because imagine like even before I had all these resources that I had, curated before I ever went through something really traumatic. And because I was using those for the people in our facilities and, clients and stuff. And so I had all these resources and they outdate very quickly because people aren't updating the databases because they're usually again government funded out of grants because somebody's doing some research. They're measuring these
Mm.
things. They're not really doing it for anything else except to prove something for somebody's academic research, as far as I'm concerned. But when you do try to click on a resource that somebody has given you in a healthcare setting, you wind up clicking and doing and doing. And then by the time you get through it, then you get a hold of somebody and they're asking you questions that have nothing to do with the grief you're experiencing at the moment, then it could be doubly traumatizing because what they're trying to do is also capture information about ACEs, like the adverse childhood experiences thing. If somebody is losing their friend, family member, or a pet or whatever, they don't want to be asked questions about witnessing childhood abuse or murder. It's like just let them talk to somebody while they're going through their grief. So I was already prepared for that, thankfully, when I was still trying to find these resources when I was going through some major grieving processes. And I finally just gave up. And I'm like, what happens to the normal person who does not have experience on how to create boundaries or even know the type of language they're going to be, faced with when they call these places?
Right. And when you're already in a place of uh, what's the word? Not chaos, but
Huh? Turmoil.
yes, yeah. When you're in already a place of need, you don't have as much capacity for the patients to also continue to find it. A lot of people, I think, in recovery, when you're in that place of catastrophe of needing, if one meeting says it's set up and you show up and it's not, or it's canceled for the day or something like that, it can be devastating because you already don't have the capacity or the tolerance or the 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 all around that extra, I don't know what to call it, but that extra energy you don't have because you're in it. You're so in it. You don't have that extra will almost to find or keep finding or keep trying or I'll try again. Like that might have been the most try you had in that
Mhm.
moment. And so when it's not available, it's like, yeah, I guess it doesn't exist. I guess I just have to do this alone. I guess I can't get the help. At least that's kind of how my brain works a lot of times.
Yeah. Whew.
Yeah. So tell me, Melissa, a little bit. You mentioned your brother. This is recent, but I also know from talking about you in, well, I don't know if we discussed it in the last episode you were in season 2, but I know you and I have talked a bit back and forth through different mediums. And I know you've lost quite a few people in your life. So you are someone who is no stranger to grief, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But that also gives you a superhero uh, way of being able to kind of lay it out for other people. This ain't your first barbecue, so to speak.
No, it's not. Like you said, yeah, I'm definitely no stranger to grief. I never have been. death and dying is one thing, but people can grieve all kinds of different things. Loss of a career, loss of physical mobility, loss of security and safety. So growing up, you know, I experienced the loss of my mother very young. It was her 45th birthday, and I was just getting ready to go on scholarship at Tremaine. So it wasn't until my brother was passing, and we'll get back to that, that I realized I never had an opportunity to process that grief. So I had lost my mother. I had already been on my own since I was 17 because my grandmother had suffered a stroke right before 16, 17. And so right there, I had lost security, safety, really, um, what do you call it, like consistent love and security. So I had already lost that too. Didn't get to grieve that. So without that, then I lose my mom, get on scholarship, and I'm thinking, I have already experienced those losses. And it was going through the most recent losses that I'll get back to that I realized, okay, I survived that without any tools. And I made it this far, 20 some more years later, almost 30 years later, that I'm like, okay, I know I can heal just like all of our scar tissue. It proves our ability to heal. But, like I said, grief can come in many forms. I've also grieved the loss of my career at one point because when I came back after doing a wonderful show for many years, the climate had changed, the idea of auditioning. I'd had a small, very small knee surgery, and I was being pulled in other directions, and that were going great. So again, I didn't have to grieve that because I didn't feel like I had lost anything because I'd gained so much anyway. But then, right when things were going great, my business burnt down, and so I had to grieve the loss of this beautiful business that I'd spent so much time, investing in, not just financially, but like the people and the community that had gleaned. I had a business called Controlled Burn Fitness. Funny, it burnt down. It was in Glendale, and I did a lot of therapeutic yoga. I worked with elite athletes and dancers, and I think you've mentioned before that I did specialize in working with people with hypermobility and pelvic floor dysfunction and stress and chronic pain and sleep management issues. So I loved what I did. And when that business burnt down, I lost not just the community, but I lost my identity. Because when I was no longer a dancer, I was at least to say, oh, I'm a fitness professional. I deal with elite athletes and dancers. And I felt very proud of that. So here I lost my income, my community, and my identity. That I luckily had some resources that helped me get through that. That was through Career Transitions for Dancers, which is now, I guess, through the Actors Fund in Los Angeles. So I was able to access some really great career counseling and some other counseling that was really, really helpful. So that was great. And that's, kind of educated me on it's really important to find these resources in the event you'll need them. Kind of that prophylactic care, like take care of your body, warm it up so you don't get injured. Our emotions and our minds are no different, and we need to exercise that resilience, and that comes within community. Um, Another really great lesson with grief came from one of my amazing clients right before my business had burnt down. She was a very amazing, high, functioning, she still is, professional. And she was newly married to an amazing man. And he passed away unexpectedly, suddenly, kind of like my brother recently. And she taught me so much about have those really important conversations with your loved ones because accidents can happen in an instant. And she realized like she didn't even know how to deal with the bank accounts, all this stuff. So she couldn't even really grieve because she had to deal with all this clerical, admin stuff. Like how do you get the car repossessed, because she can't access the bank account. So there's a lot that goes on with grief. So I'm like, here I thought I'm really prepared for grief, right? I also was the first person to talk about death and dying and encouraging people to talk about advanced directives. If I was dating young men, I'd say, where are you going to be buried? Are you going to be buried or cremated? I never thought, yeah, like, I like those are important conversations. Like, I don't want to have to go traipse into some cemetery across the country to go say bye to someone.
Let's just pause 1 second and just imagine what that date looks like. Like How funny are you? There is some dude walking around right now saying, if someone asks him, what was your most interesting date? And he's like, well, this one time I dated this woman who asked me what my death plan was.
It wasn't like the first date.
It was the second or third thing.
No, this is when things were getting serious. Actually,
Got
like
it.
I'm friends with the same person too, 20 some years later. He's married and everything. But when things were getting serious, I said, are you going to be going to church on Sundays? And he said, of course I am. I said, are your children going to be going to church on Sundays? He said, of course I am. I'm like, why would they go to church when I've never known you to go to church in the whole year and a half I've known you? Whoa, whoa, whoa. And then I said, well, are you going to be buried or cremated? And he said, well, buried, of course. And I said, why? And he goes, well, so my kids have something to visit. And say, I'm like, you're going to keep your kid like tethered to some state that they may not ever want to live in. And we got in a pretty heated argument in it. He's like, you're just going to let me be burned? And again, this is no disrespect to anybody's preference for how they, take care of their death, dying, and grieving process, and reverence to whoever's left. That's everybody's thing. But these are conversations that you want to have with the person you're going into life business with. And what's going to happen to your body, how are they going to care for you when you're on your deathbed? Those type of things are important, that give you some strength and agency through the grieving process, because grief doesn't happen always at the moment of complete loss. You can be grieving as someone is declining, and I know you are aware of that too, because you just experienced that recently. If I don't know if we can talk about
Yes.
that.
No, of course. Yes. The anticipatory grief. Yes.
Exactly, and that's a real thing. And so if we have these conversations about death and dying, grief, the loss of a career, the loss of our mobility, the loss of anything, even if it's only for a short period of time, it gives us a little bit of physical, mental, and emotional awareness of how we might navigate those situations that kind of come up unexpectedly. So if we have those conversations with our community, in the event that you're hit by some huge grief avalanche, your community is already there to understand how to navigate your wild and crazy emotions, or the fact that some people don't get wild and crazy. They may just become very, very, self contained, and may just retreat completely.
Hmm.
So my experiences with grief have come across everything from learning from others. When the pandemic started, I was on Clubhouse with a lot of people, that social media audio app, and I was always part of the grief and death and dying groups, because I've always been there to talk about, death very matter of factly, and I encourage people to read like Mary Roach's book Stiff, and it's kind of humorous, scientific-y, fun stuff, and I loved there are these two brothers that have a podcast called Let's Talk About Death, and it's these two twin brothers. One is a psychiatrist or psychologist. He's psychiatrist, yeah. And the other brother is works in the funeral business. And I think now they're both in the business. It's been a family business. And so I used to be in their rooms a lot, and telling people how to talk about death and dying and grief. Well, I thought with all my experience, I knew everything there was about grief, right?
Hmm.
And as you know, I was totally blindsided by something that I had not had on my radar, which was traumatic grief. Um, on May 31st, 2021, I witnessed the brutal and horrific murder of my neighbor in front of our homes in broad daylight. And not only, like, my neighbor who'd been with us for like, I'd lived here since 2009. He'd been there before me. My husband knew him before I did. Um, I'm grieving this person who was such a huge part of my life that I didn't even realize how important he was in my life, because you take your neighbors for granted, especially if you like them, they're just always there. And also trying to keep my brain intact after witnessing something so horrific. I was lucky, like I said earlier, that I had all these resources. The moment after, the police got everything taken care of and they arrested the guy, I went into the house and I went and called EAP, which is my employee assistance program. And I'm lucky that I was employed at the time through this large healthcare system. And I always told people, no matter what happens to you, even if it's not at work and you're in a crisis, just call EAP. They will have the resources for you. And luckily they did. And there were 24-hour hotlines that I was able to call throughout the next few nights, because I could not sleep because of the flashbacks. And it wasn't till a few months later that the grieving started, because I missed the sounds of my neighbor. I missed the things that I took for granted. I missed the safety that I didn't realize he provided on the days that my husband was gone, like on a marathon, trip or whatever. And so loss of safety again, childhood, loss of predictable, schedules and stuff. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And the grief of losing somebody so important who is older than me, who is nurturing and amazing. It was wild, but what helped me too was that we got his kitty cat, Queen Elizabeth Shark Week, and caring for something else always at least reminded me to eat, reminded me to, drink water because when I'd care for the cats, it would remind me I'd have to do it. Because if I didn't have those cats to take care of, I don't think I could have taken care of me, which could have also compounded the inability to heal from the grief. And at the same time, remember, this is the pandemic only going into like a year of it. My husband had to still work, and he was transporting bodies. He was doing all these things, turning people over in the hospital. And again, I thought I was prepared for traumatic grief, even because just a couple of months before my neighbor was murdered, I was doing bedside meditations for people for COVID. Like, I did the last bedside meditation for my friend Charlie Barnes the day before he died. He died of COVID. His wife called me and she said, "Could you please see if you can do a bedside meditation?" And I was lucky that my former supervisor, who recently retired, I called him and I said, "Is there a way you can hook me up with somebody at the nurses station at that hospital?" Because I was in LA County, they were down in Orange County. And he helped me get a hold of a nurse, and they patched me through because they weren't allowed to do that for people who weren't family members. And his wife was able to talk to the right people to say, please let her do it. And she couldn't even see her husband, and she was afraid to see him. So I was able to sit there and provide a meditation for him, watching him, this is somebody who I had known since I was 12 years old and who was one of my biggest champions. See, I get emotional about this. And professionally, I was able to hold space for that because it was so beautiful that his wife trusted me, because she said the only nights he ever slept really soundly were the nights that he came and took your therapeutic yoga class. Could you do this for him so he won't be in pain? And so I have grief, but like I'm emotional right now talking about it because somebody trusted me to hold space for their grief, for their beloved's passing, and they knew I would not be traumatized by it. I wasn't. And so the reason I'm emotional is that thinking people really trusted my ability to hold space for grief. But when it was time for me to experience grief, my neighbor's murder, and then we'll come to my brother, I really wasn't expecting what I experienced. But it is actually necessary to allow ourselves to be emotional, to have that community to listen, to not judge, and to honor exactly what you ask for, and to honor what you say you do not want is essential. Because people may mean well because they know what worked for their mom or their dad or themselves, and they go, well, she doesn't know, she needs this. And they try to impose what they think is best, even if you really clearly state what you don't need. It's really important that to understand that everybody's going to experience your grief and witnessing your grief differently. And so that's why it was kind of hard to know that people trusted me to hold space for their grief, but they also weren't always that great at honoring my requests on how I preferred to navigate the grieving process. Because when I remember after my neighbor was murdered, there were certain things I did not want to see, and it seemed really silly. I specifically texted people like, just send me pictures of cats and plants, absolutely no people. And so sure enough, or like animal, like some of my friend would send me her horses pictures, like whatever. And my friend, but I had a friend who I love dearly, but she would send pictures with her children. And I couldn't handle it because I love this person so much and I love her family. And their neighbors also. And what was going through my head was, what if this had happened because I used to go over the house a lot, like at night, and then at night her husband would walk me back. And I'm thinking, heaven forbid this murder happened to him on his way home from dropping me off across the street. I would never have been able to live with myself. So every time I saw a picture of them or the kids, it would send me down the flashbacks and the spiral of trauma
Mhm.
and on top of the grief. And again, creating anticipatory grief that was unrealistic, but when your brain is going through something traumatic, it doesn't know how to defragment that grieving process. So that was important.
I think it's really great that you're talking about different people need different things. And I'm willing to also throw in and assume. I don't like to make a lot of assumptions, although that's the only thing my brain ever likes to do. But different griefs for different, like you grieve differently for different people or different things, right? Like you're saying, I think it's really important to bring up what I would call, or what I've heard called day to day. So your day to day, the people that are in your life day to day, like this neighbor, um, maybe more, you may find it more challenging to grieve than maybe a family, not saying your brother, but a family member that maybe you're not as close with, meaning you don't see them day to day. You might have grown up with them, but maybe they're an old friend that, yes, you had a relationship with, but you don't see them every day. They're not checking in every day. You don't see that. You don't hear their TV. You don't hear, like those types of things. I think there's something very difficult, specifically when it comes to day-to-day grief, someone who's in your day-to-day life, versus whatever the other of that is, the not day-to-day, but the, other moments in time. Um, and I think it's important to allow people to grieve different people, different things differently. There is one particular person, um, there's that it surprised me, my grief with them, and that is Mr. Matthew Dickens. Like, did you know Matt Dickens?
I didn't.
Oh my
No.
gosh, I find that so weird because he was a Claude Thompson person.
So maybe I
Matthew
only know
Dickens.
Matthew, and maybe I know his face.
Yes, I'm gonna, we can pause, we can take this out if
I want to
needed,
know.
but I just need to show this.
Okay, let me know who this is. Oh my God, yes!
Matthew Dickens, yes. So Matthew, you knew him as Matthew, yes. So
Maddie.
Maddie, okay, yes. So Matthew Dickens was someone I had met just through, like doing, I think I did a show for him, or I can't even remember exactly where I met him, but we became fairly close. And I did a little dance for him for Jazz Dance LA, which we didn't actually end up performing, but we did end up putting on film. And I met some other people through that process. And then he came to like some of my dance shows. And at the time, it was like recession. It was the 2008 ish, 9-ish recession. And so there wasn't a ton going on. So
Yeah,
he
this is
was
right after Claude passed, so I actually completely was out of the dance world in those days.
right. And so, but I knew he was a Claude guy. Like he was one of Claude's people. And I would go to his house, once a week and just he would like make food. He was like a really good cook. And so he'd show me how he was making things and I would just hang out. And his friend Edgar would come over, who's very well known in the industry as well. And we would just hang out. And we had not been in touch when he passed. And literally someone hit me up on Facebook, one of his family members, and was like, hey, I'm sorry to tell you, but Matthew passed away. And I didn't even know he was sick. And a lot of people didn't know he was sick. He kept it very
I
much.
He passed away.
Yes. And I think he passed away in 2014.
Oh, wow.
And so a lot of us didn't know he was sick. And we did a big memorial. My friend Jackie Evans and I did a big memorial at the PAC for him. But I was shocked at how much his particular passing affected me and continues to affect me. And I can't tell you why. I just don't know. And he was part of my daily life in a moment in time, but he had long since been that for me. But there's something about him that really just got me and was just still to this day. I miss him. And I don't know what that is. And I think it's like very individual. It's very particular. And I love that you talked about all the different types of grief because we've been talking about that this season. And I think it's so important. Like everybody gives everybody grace when they've had a family member pass or a loved one close to them. And now even pets, I think people have started to accept. I feel like when I was growing up, pets were like, you were not really, it was kind of like, Okay, like it was kind of a get over it vibe, and maybe that's just where I grew up or the family I grew up in. But I'm glad that it is now, since I feel like culturally very acceptable to grieve big your pets, and I think that's right. Uh, but all these little other griefs you talked about, loss of identity. I think this is so major and something we do not talk about, and is a cause of so much strife in people, because eventually you will also have to grieve your identity, because most people are not going to work until the day they die. If you're lucky to grow old enough, you will have to retire or change your profession. And even if you change from one profession you love to another profession you love, there may have to be a grief period.
Little changes. Yeah.
Yes. And I think loss of identity is a really big one. I face that with my injury. I face that now. Like I'm in one of those periods of indefinite transition, what I would call an in between, and a very gray, if you may, space, a very maybe space. I do not enjoy it. Let's put it that way. I if you I am very rarely indecisive in everything. And it is something I absolutely cannot tolerate. I cannot tolerate being indecisive. It's very hard for me to be in the gray, very hard for me to be in the maybe, very hard for me to be in the in between. So that it also in particular drives me crazy, and that's where I've been. But I also think, like, as performers, we barely talk about what I have known as a show letdown, meaning when you close a show. So
Oh,
one, and this doesn't have to be, this could be you've been on Broadway with the same cast for 5 years, or this could be you did a cruise ship with the same people, 6 months, a 6 month contract. This could be a 10-day run. This could be a 3-day, 2-day rehearsal, 1-day show, because we spend these concentrated, very intimate amounts of time together in the entertainment business. Not only do you spend, it's very intimate in the creative conception of things, even if you are not specifically responsible for the creative input. It is all very creative and collaborative. And you're barely meeting people and they're like, hello, nice to meet you. And they have their hands on you in a way that is, hello, nice to meet you. And their hands are on your butt. It's the only way that they could be for you to be safe. And that is just how it goes. And obviously this is all consent based, and, nothing shady is happening, hopefully, that I know of. But there is this immediate intimacy that you have to do a creative venture. You trust other people. You have to trust them, because sometimes it can be very dangerous. Your spacing, your cues, what's happening with props. Things can be dangerous. You really trust these people. And everybody, I feel like my line of work over the past however many years, and you can agree or disagree, when I listen to other people talk about their professions, there is often, oh, so and so I have to work with. Oh, I can't believe it. Like, oh my God, these people I have to work with. And I never had that experience. All of my work in the entertainment business, yes, there are performers I like more than maybe other performers, but I like them all.
you
Just
instantly
some,
bond with the family so fast.
yes. And there's very rarely, ever, if ever, there's been someone I'm like, yeah, that person I just don't get along with. It very rarely.
You didn't really gel with them on that project, you'll run into them, like, 6 years later, you're like, "Oh my god, I love you." It's
Right,
like
good to see you, right? Yeah. So there is like this very close knit thing that happens in these creative moments and on these projects. And you have this very unique, once in a lifetime experience for each of these projects. And every time they end, there is a grief, whether
yeah,
people want to acknowledge it or not. It's the end of seeing those people. It's the end of having that dynamic, electric feeling. It's the end of the paycheck on that job, right? It's the end of feeling important on that job, because a lot of times these jobs are very, very hard to come by. They're hard to get. You feel special because you get treated special because you are in these moments. And then you're back to, you're the help. And a lot of them you're special for 2 moments and then you are not. But all of that has a grief to it that I think not only do we not always recognize, but we certainly don't process. And so if you're a dancer or performer and you're listening to this podcast, and you're like, dings are going off in your head, like, oh, that's why after a job I'm always kind of a little down, or oh, that's after like I get the Sunday scaries, like that's the Sunday scaries are like, oh no, Monday's coming. But it's those types of feelings, and I think it would behoove us to acknowledge, and I don't even know if we have to go through this whole funeral procession of these things, but to just even acknowledge that, like, yeah, that's why I feel like that. Yeah, this was a thing, and it's not normal in other
your house for 3 days after something is done. You bring up the greatest point, because I've brought this up before about I again how I thought I was capable of dealing with loss and grief because of this, and I've used it as an example. I said with relationships, I go, I'm friends with pretty much all of my exes because I learned you learn how to fall fast, love hard, okay, and then you say goodbye. And none of these breakups were for any fault of anyone's own, because like contracts ended. I used to date a lot of musicians in the shows. You like, and it was never gross or disgusting. Like if you're stuck someplace for 3 to 6 months, you're gonna bond with certain people who like the same music and want to cook after a show. And some people want to go out in the town. Some people want to just sit and read a book. And so you bond that way, and then like, okay, your contract's going. Oh, you're taking a show someplace else, and you say goodbye, and there was no ill will. And it brings me to think about you. And I remember Claude used to call him Maddie. He would always. So you brought up something with that, saying like, for me, it felt like why certain losses were harder that may have seemed peripheral to others is that these are our chosen mentors and friends.
Mhm.
And when we choose that mentor, it's even harder. Like, with family, it's, maybe an obligation, or it's just, what do you call it? It's just habit. And with those people that you couldn't wait to go see, that you changed your schedule to see them, doesn't mean your family wasn't as important, but we got to make adult choices without any obligation to love those people and spend time with them. And they knew your intimate stories. And like the thing is, like when I lost Davy, my neighbor, I didn't know how much the sounds of his life were part of my orchestration of my everyday life. And that's one of the things I'd written something about that he, the sound of his cats were our conductors. When he'd call for the cats, or I'd hear his sliding glass door in the morning. And when he passed, like I was the one who helped his family, because I'm like, "Oh, don't forget on trash day you have to do this. Oh, on this day you have to check the this." And I knew what he did to care for his house. I knew what time of year he tended to his trees, and when he had to change the timing on his sprinklers. And his family's like, I didn't even think about that. And it's weird that we don't realize that if we're friends with our neighbors, whether it's an apartment or a home, we know some of their comings and goings better than their family does. And that's what brings, if you want to talk about my brother and how different that loss was for that, I think Davy, the loss of my neighbor, helped prepare me for my brother. I mean, I'm still just reeling from my brother, but I can speak of it differently than the loss of Davy. Like, I still cry for that. I cry about my brother randomly, like driving. My long drives are when I used to call him all the time. I'm gonna be grieving that probably for the rest of my life. I mean, I'm usually wearing his necklace where I have his ashes, all the time, but I didn't want to wear it today just because I'm super sweaty. um, and so we all grieve in different ways, and we may think we're prepared for it. No one's ever going to be prepared for any type of grief, but if we practice even in conversation or contemplation in communities like this, or even hearing podcasts like this, we can start going, okay, what's my last meal gonna be? And realizing you may not even get a chance to choose your last meal.
Mhm.
People talk about death and like, how would you like to die? Well, guess what? Your idea of how you want to die is probably not going to be the reality. You learn that when you witness someone either murdered or witnessing a loved one decline. And if you're fortunate enough, if you choose to be at bedside with them, you may not be prepared for what you experience. And you have to have, and I will say have to, I don't I don't mind saying I have to on this or a should on this, is that you have to be in conversation with friends and family members who are also going to be close to that grief before a grieving process may happen, because it can create a whole myriad of other problems that have nothing to do with death and dying. So yikes. And I thank you for bringing up the pets thing, because pets in this day and age, I think it's really important because families and communities are so fragmented and siloed now that pets do become essential bearers of our grief and supporters for our grief, and more so probably in the last 20 or 30 years. So, because families are not, as tight as they used to, and people travel for work now, and they do all kinds of things. So, the loss of a pet is nothing to just, brush off. So thanks for
Yeah, I
bringing that.
love that you said that. I think there's so much to be said about the changing ideas of tribalism, or how our, what once our tribal idea was to survive and what it is now, and how families just look different now, or we've accepted that families can look different now, or maybe not everyone has, but most people have now accepted that not every family looks like a man, a woman, and 2.5 kids. Like, families look different. And not everybody's blood
Different.
family. Sorry, go
And
ahead.
careers are different because people used to stay the same exact career from start to finish 30 years. Careers are transitory. Families are fragmented. Yeah, yeah. That's
So
why.
the grief is going to come up more and more often than maybe many years ago, where someone, like you said, had that one job and only had to do that one grief when they retired, and that was just it. They didn't have to fight that identity, many times over, as they shifted and found their way through different, careers and whatnot. I think it's pretty rare now that someone just does one career their entire life.
And to compound that, what people don't realize is, like, people talk about resilience. You need to build resilience. Well, you can't become resilient on your own. You need those moments to have somebody hold your house together, literally, while you have your breakdown. And people need to be able to break down. And that's why different cultures have, people there, for days on end or even a year. There are these processes that used to happen. I mean, the bodies used to be in the homes, for days. People died in their homes, and so people are as, detached from death, dying, and grief as they are knowing where their chicken comes from in the supermarket. So when it finally happens, yeah, they may have been dealing with these like micro griefs and losses, but they've never had a chance to process it because there is no community or time that lends those spaces to cry or contemplate or do whatever ablutions you need to help, cleanse your soul of what's, burdening you from this loss. So it's really important to realize that you can't tell someone to become resilient and do some self-care if they don't have someone pulling up the slack for them. And that comes from community. And your community could be something as simple as, luckily, these online groups, like a narrative medicine group or a dance, or, a Zoom dance class. Or if it weren't for the dance classes that I was able to take on Zoom, I mean, Lisa Biagini at Steps on Broadway, she has no idea that she was better therapy than anything could have possibly provided for me. I mean, of course, I did see a therapist during all this trauma and grief and loss, but I was luckily, I had a therapist that would literally write in the aftercare notes, keep taking dance class, or 3 dance classes this week.
Mm.
And I would come to your class online because I knew time was of the essence, that I couldn't waste time putting clothes on and brushing my teeth first thing in the morning, then driving to a class. I could be in my pajamas. I could not have my camera on, but I could at least listen to you or Michelle Elkin or Lisa Biagini or any of these teachers. Oh God, I remember Nicholas Palmquist taking his master classes online was like nourishment. I mean, it was great to hear community, and even the sound of people coming into the dance room reminded me of those happy times because I grew up with, Claude and Hama saying, when you're sad, you go to dance class. When you're happy, you go to dance class. And so while I was grieving, dance, just showing up, and even if I just sat down or laid on the floor with a cat and listened to class for an hour, it was better than any drug could have ever done. Luckily, I did not medicate myself. It was suggested, do you want to take some anti-anxieties? Do you want, I'm like, I'm fortunate I don't have to go work outside of the home right now. I had that luxury and that privilege. So I was able to literally lay on the floor in my grief and imagine taking a dance class. That may not work for everybody, but for a very physical person, it was a necessity.
You want to
Sorry.
talk about
Mhm.
resilience? I read somewhere, or I listened to an audiobook or something somewhere, that resilience isn't something that we're born with. It's something that we have to kind of,
Conditioned.
yes. So it's like a muscle that we're not born with. We have to like create that muscle. And then that muscle is what it flexes as we go through turmoil. So
I
for
believe
someone,
children are held and all that stuff. That's why kids who are left in orphanages, who are not having those tactile, comforting experiences, wind up with some major, major behavioral issues and bonding issues. So it's that sense of security that comes not just from having people around, but the sense of touch, really does impact people's ability to create those awarenesses. I'm not being articulate. That there are research studies you can read on this about how being held and being nurtured and being comforted does help lend resilience, because the hormones that are released in our body through touch for the presence of others really does help people build build, like I said, resilience. So yeah, there's
Right.
several
It's definitely not something we just come with. It's not so and I bring that up and talk an extension on what you're saying because don't beat yourself up if you don't feel like you're very resilient. It's not something you were supposed to come in with. It was something we have to try to create through going through situations or creating our own ways of feeling cared for, which is really hard as you get older and as an adult. If you don't have that, you have to kind of recreate it or reparent, like kind of parent yourself, stuff like that. Um, do you have uh, any kind of a belief system or a spirituality that kind of helps you with your grief? And on the other side of that question, I usually follow up with any kind of unexplained mystical magical
things.
experiences surrounding grief that you might want to share with people.
Ooh, I yes and yes. Before all the traumatic grief, before losing my neighbor and my brother, part of the things I used to always bring into these conversations about the universal cycles of life, including death and dying, as well as birth and, growth, is that nature, it seems like it's such a cliche, but as someone, I mean, one of the other hats I wear, I'm a California native plant education and outreach specialist. And I love to show people that what looks dead at certain times a year is something that is dormant. There's a difference between dead and dormant, and certain things are dead. Some have very short lifespans, like an annual wildflower. Some things last forever and they die, but we're all gonna die. It's a process. And so nature has always been my, faith or philosophy. And I've been blessed to have studied history of world religions and different, in the 90s when I was first in college and second time again. And then I continue to explore all these different faiths and philosophies. And many of them, I think all of them that I've studied, all do have that one thing in common, is that they do use nature as metaphor for these conversations about death and dying. So I look to the beauty within the weeds. The weeds to me represent, there's just enough goodness left in that barren soil. What you may think is barren, dead soil, if there's a weed there, that is a beacon of hope that life can still emerge for something horrible. But I'm not going to use that as something that tells people that everything's okay when it's not. So I think nature has always been my go-to faith or philosophy, and yet I have wonderful friends who are pastors, who are reverends, who are chaplains, and I believe that all of us that are walking this earth with compassion are also the stewards of these messages. And if we surround ourselves with people who are doing good and keeping our eyes out for those people doing good, kind of like how Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers.
Hmm.
The day after my neighbor was murdered, I knew exactly where to go. And this person is a plant person. I called Mr. Mike Evans from Tree of Life Nursery. And he doesn't even know he's this important to me. I'm getting weepy just thinking about this. I called him. I said, I need to come to the nursery. Can I come, hang out at Redwood Camp? And he said, sure, I'll be around if you need me. And I told him what happened. And he left me this beautiful Christian prayer. I'm not a Christian, whatever. It was the most beautiful thing he could have left for me. And he knew how much space to give me. And then when he came, he saw me on the ground underneath this manzanita that I love. He said, yeah, you need to get up now. And I'm going to put you in the hammock. You need to get off the ground. You're going to be okay. He's like, I need to tell you something. And I'm misquoting probably, but he said, you've now been initiated into a club that you had no desire to be a member of.
Hmm.
And you've witnessed something really terrible, but you're here and you knew where to come. But just know that because of this membership, you are now going to be responsible, if you so choose, to open your arms to the next person who's going to cross this threshold who didn't want to be here either. And he said, "So you're gonna lay here in this hammock, look at the sky, look at the trees, stay here for no more than an hour or so. You're gonna get up and you're gonna be fine." And just hearing that, it was very matter of fact. It was so nurturing,
Hmm.
and I was so lucky. I knew where to go. And oh golly, I wasn't expecting this. You always make me cry. Um, it was the most beautiful, comforting, safest experience I could have ever asked for. And it gave me enough strength to get to the next day and the next day. And, because I was too scared to go out in my garden anymore. I couldn't go out in the front yard after seeing what I saw out there.
Hmm. Hmm.
And he said, "If you ever need to come to the nursery, just come here. It's safe." And I had those spaces. And so, um, that to me is part of a mystical experience in a way, is that I knew where to go. I was drawn to the right place. But I do have one really kooky story about my mom, if you want to hear that
Yes, yes, I do. I
one.
also want to just
At first,
we talked so lightly about the, or maybe we didn't even really identify it, but I also want to kind of shout out the I the situation of complex PTSD or PTSD along with a loss. I think that that is its whole entire own category. And if grief wasn't difficult enough, the PTSD, the post traumatic stress disorder that can happen from either witnessing a shocking traumatic event of someone's loss, or even if, depending on how sensitive you are, and I'm not saying sensitive like weak, I'm saying sensitive to smells, sounds, sights, things, like some of us are just like to be in a hospital might be too much, like a frazzle of the nervous system for people who are highly sensitive. And so some of the end of life stuff that might be very normal to other people might already be super traumatic, or you may be experiencing trauma. And the thing about that I've learned about post traumatic stress is that the incident doesn't define if it's post traumatic stress for you. The incident, like what happens, isn't actually classifiable. It is how you have experienced that event. Now, obviously, everyone, if you witness a murder, you're in it. You like, oh, yes, everyone is happy to give you that ticket, right? Because we all understand or have collectively, even without having a conversation, have decided that that is traumatic. People going to war, yes, that is traumatic. Now, the interesting thing is that half of, maybe not as many of us would give that ticket to all the nurses that worked during the pandemic. I would. I think they went to war. I
oh,
think they saw
we
what
still have
happens in war.
to take a breath yet. They still haven't gotten a chance to breathe or recover, and they're still gets everything. It's horrible.
So,
I feel
like, and that's so I will give them that, but maybe not everyone would, depending on what their ideas are. Nonetheless, it doesn't matter what other people think. But if basically, I say this because for a very long time, I wanted to qualify because that's how I do everything. I have to qualify, and I have uh, neglected myself of a lot of healing over the years by talking myself out of qualifying. And the
oh,
thing is that your the how you metabolize situations is what qualifies you for having post traumatic stress. It's not the incident. It doesn't matter if everybody else thought that that wasn't a big deal. If it was a big deal to you, that is what matters. So the the compound of grief of witnessing something traumatic, whether it was watching a parent waste away and you just couldn't get over that last picture of how they looked, of how it looked, when death came over them. That can be traumatic for some people, for a lot of people probably. But so I just want to throw that out there because it's very clear you witnessing that atrocity was PTSD, like that qualifies. And on top of the grief, it's so much. So I want to give that shout out to anybody who did, on top of their grief, witness something that was traumatic, but also things that maybe other people may not see as traumatic, but that you as a person experienced and you're having flashbacks and it still keeps you up at night, or you just, all the things, all the symptoms, right? It is not what people say, it is how you have experienced it. But now I want to hear the magical story of your mother.
so my mom died. Like I knew when she was. I had a feeling. I knew because I'm like she's not gonna want to be in the hospital on her 45th birthday. And I even told my uncle that I'm like she's not gonna want to be in the hospital on her 45th birthday. He's like, "We'll come and we'll take her out." And I'm like, I just knew. And kind of like it was almost very similar to the night my brother was dying. My brother's fiance and I just knew what was going to happen. So anyway, at like 4 in the morning, I get the call, or my uncle's like, "Okay, we're gonna come to get you. Your mom's passing." So my brother and my uncle and I are there with my mom, and she'd always raised us with the "do not resuscitate," all this stuff. But then when we get there, the doctor said at the last minute yesterday she wanted to be resuscitated, and it's up to you guys. And so here we are, 21 years old, like making this freaking end of life decision. And so we're like, okay. And then the whole time we're like, okay, this is what she told us. And then what do you do? She's dead and we're on our own. I had already been on my own for years already. And it was weird. My uncles took us home to their house and we, stayed in different rooms. And then the dogs had always slept on their bed. And that night, one slept with me, one slept with my brother. Kind of kooky, no big deal. Like, okay, great. Then my mom's service, her crazy husband played these really depressing songs, and we knew my mom wanted to listen to like Stevie Ray Vaughan and things like that if she ever died. Sure enough, we put in like the CD changers that had like 10 CDs, and we put them on random. And what's the first one? Stevie Ray Vaughan's Little Wing. Well, okay, that's kind of kooky. Well, my brother and I were hoping my mom would come see us in a dream. Nothing ever happened. 6 months later, when like a week before I was going to start scholarship, because I postponed it, so I needed money, and so I went to go do this weird CD thing for these people who were on tour, and I was going to sell their CDs or merch. And we had a day off, and they said you can go to the Grand Canyon or you can go to Sedona. So this girl and I went to Sedona. We go in the church, the lighted window, like on that hill. It's a all glass church, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go light a candle. I go to light a candle. I'm with this lady Lisa. She went one way, I went the other. Go to light the candle, and I went to put my hand on my shoulder because I thought Lisa had just put her hand on my shoulder, and no one was there.
Mm.
And I was like, and I ran to the window, just like I scampered to the window to look out, and I was trying not to cry. And then I felt another hand on my other shoulder, and it was my mom, as far as I'm concerned. It was my mom. And at that moment, I thought back to a year before. My mom and I had just reconciled. I had gone to see her. She had lived in the home where Richard Ramirez had murdered two little old ladies. And I didn't know this. And the clock had stopped, and I asked her what's going on. She's like, "Do you want to know?" She tells me that. She hands me some money. For the first, my mom had never given us money, whatever. And she's like, "Go do something nice for yourself tonight." So she gave me $20, and this is 1994. I drove to this little sushi restaurant on Brand Boulevard in Glendale. I was sitting next to this lady, and we're talking, and she's like, "Oh, what are your family like?" She asked me about my mom, and she said, "I just want you to know that your mom's going to mean more to you once she passes than when she is alive right now." I'm like, who the hell's the lady? I'm like, okay, whatever. She leaves before me. She was staying at some hotel on Brand, she said. I go to drive. I go, "Sure you don't want to ride?" I go to drive. I never saw that woman again. She was nowhere on the streets. I circled the streets. That woman did not exist. So sure enough, like that moment, I felt those hands on my shoulders. I thought of that woman from a year before, and I'm like, could this be some sort of kooky thing? Who knows? And I still think about this to this day because there were things before my brother's passing that only his fiance and I kind of could talk about and understand, and people would probably think we were insane. But there's so many strange things that you can't explain that I'm like, I don't need to explain them. I'll find out when it's time. So that's my story.
I love it. Yes, I love it. And I've had quite a few dreams where people have visited me that have passed. That seems to be kind of a portal of some kind of communication. In one of them, I got information that I had no way of knowing. My grandmother on my mom's side, who had passed, she was like the first person I knew that passed in my life, that was close. I think I was like 11, 12 when she passed. And quite a few, like maybe 8 years ago or something like that, I had a dream that we were in my mom's kitchen and my grandmother was there, and she was there, and I walked in. She was kind of like catching up. We were all catching up, right? And she kind of looked at me and she said, I don't understand exactly what you do, but I understand why you do it, as far as like my profession. And yeah, very like, okay. And then she looked at my mom and she said, I really wish you would have put the shed underneath the house. And I just thought that was so weird. And so I had asked, like a couple days later, I told my mom, I said, I had this dream and grandma was there and she said, I really wish you would have put the shed under the house. I'm like, what is that? And she goes, and my mom said, oh, yes, we've been discussing basically tearing down that shed and putting, like basically enclosing underneath the house into like kind of a storage area, which they did end up doing. My mom and my dad, but I had no way of knowing that. I wasn't living at home. I was not privy to any of those conversations. Um, Nor would it have been anything I would have been concerned or interested in as far as that kind of conversation. So, and I've had a couple other people who were close or not close to me come to me in dreams and say something. So we'll see going forward. What other things have transpired or will transpire, but yeah, it's there's a lot. I'm finding that every person I've had on this podcast has multiple stories like that. One big one, and then many others that could be also big, or just there is no lack of interesting coincidences or not so interesting. So thank you for that story.
Oh,
So I have one more question for you,
yes, ma'am.
Miss Melissa. I've said this on all the podcasts. I don't like to give advice unsolicited, although it's kind of what I do. I'm trying to be better at it. But without asking for advice, but a suggestion. Do you have a suggestion that you could give to anyone who might be suffering, like really in the thick of grief right now?
Phew. While they're suffering, I would not know what to tell somebody because I don't know their history. I can only speak on what I experienced. Patience, um, honesty if you can. No, practice saying something out loud as simple as what you really don't want, and practice saying out loud what you really need. If it's something as simple as like, can you give me a hug? You don't have to explain yourself. Don't make excuses for why you feel this way. You're allowed to feel that way. Um, you mentioned something as important as anticipatory grief. I think that was the most dangerous place for me before my brother died. I can give you a completely true confession about that.
Yeah.
I knew better. I knew better. Again, I've counseled other people. I'm not a licensed professional, but I have mentored and counseled people on how to take care of themselves during the grieving process or while somebody's declining. And when you're in it, you really can't function for yourself. So please ask people who are not involved with that person who's passing to be there for your support, because I got severely injured during my brother's decline. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't his fault. It was nobody's fault. People always thought I was doing fine because I would show up presenting really normal. My brother, like, you gotta go to dance class. You gotta do this. Well, no one knew that I wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't hydrating. I didn't even know. Even his fiance, because she and I were both not taking care of ourselves because we were 100% holding vigil for him. And one day he said, you need to go to class. So I did. So there I was, taking class from someone I have always wanted to take class from, had taken an online class from them the week before. I show up, two people that I respect and admire. My first impression basically is me being driven to urgent care by Dana Wilson.
Oh my God. Shout out Dana Wilson, the Words That Move Me podcast.
Yeah. I tore my glute med muscle.
Oh.
And then check this out. Because I stay very calm and collected, which she was like, you're super calm. I'm like, yeah. I get to urgent care. They obviously didn't know anything was wrong with me. They're trying to tell me get up and get on the X-ray. I'm like, it's more than my bone. It's not a bone thing. I'm like, something happened to my body. It does not feel attached. Well, that's impossible. Whatever. So they take an X-ray. They don't do anything. The guy never even touched me. He just looks at me, never say charting. I'm like, how do I get an MRI? I couldn't get an MRI for weeks. And they're like, well, it can't be that bad. You haven't asked for pain medication. All this stuff. Because again, I'm still trying to take care of my brother on crutches now. And so while you're grieving, people could keep telling you self care, self care, self care. If they're saying that to you, say out loud, can you please care for me? Because I can't do it myself. Because you know what? I didn't know how to say that. I didn't even think of saying it because also I'm supposed to be this expert in these things. Who wants to admit that you aren't capable of caring for yourself? Well, guess what? People cannot care for themselves efficiently during grief. I knew better professionally, but when I was in it, I couldn't find that part of me. So I also had to forgive myself and offer grace to myself that I did not choose to get injured. I did not choose to neglect myself. I've recovered from it, but also people wonder why I'm gone is that I also know that there's other things I want to do before I croak. Hopefully I won't be croaking anytime soon, but I want to get something published. I've always wanted to write. I've always wanted to do the voiceover stuff that people kept telling me to do. I talk really fast on here. People know me for putting them to sleep for my relaxing voice. So it's time for me to maybe go, okay, maybe that injury, it was inevitable. It also kept me from running away from my emotions. I had to sit with myself, but I had the tools and I knew what else I could do. Because, like I say, movement is medicine, moving my breath, moving my intentions, moving my words onto a page is still dancing, it's still choreography, So my advice would be ask for help. Even, and sometimes it's easier to ask for help from people who are not family or friends. Ask for help from strangers because guess what? They know nothing about you. If you have access to a therapist, take it. Take it, take it, even if you don't think you need it. And keep talking about death. I mean, the guys from the Let's Talk About Death podcast, they say if you're not talking about death, you aren't living.
Mm, I
Let's
love
talk.
that.
Yeah, let's talk about it now before we need it. So I'm sorry, I always babble so much. So I have no specific advice for anybody, but I can only teach from experience.
You're
Thank
so
you.
funny. You are not a babbler at all. You're very concise, very clear. I am just letting you speak because I want to hear all the good stuff, and I am trying to practice not interrupting
I said
people
that too.
on the podcast because so they can get their full thoughts out. No, very, very, very good information. Um, in the last season, talking about the body stuff, one of the things I had to learn and is a continued practice for me is that no matter what, I have to eat because my default is not to. For many reasons, because when I'm stressed out, I usually become not hungry. My anxiety, the feeling of anxiety and the feeling of hunger feel the same to me. So when I feel anxious, I don't like I can't decipher the difference between if I'm anxious or if I'm hungry. And because I do run very anxious, oftentimes it just feels like anxiety to me. And then that's a vicious cycle of anxiety not eating more breeds more anxiety, cortisol levels breeds more anxiety, so it's a very like terrible cycle to be in. But I gaining sobriety in a eating disorder type program, part of that is you have to eat. So it doesn't matter if I am anxious today, I still have to eat. It doesn't matter if I'm, didn't plan my day well and I don't have time, I still have to eat. It doesn't matter if I think that where I'm at to get food, there's no viable options, I still have to eat. It doesn't matter if someone's in the hospital, I still have to eat. It doesn't matter if someone passed away, I still have to eat. And that is that's been a hard thing for me to have to navigate because I do want to take every excuse not to take care of myself. It is so difficult for me to do that. It's just not something I either didn't learn it or it was a way of me coping or a way of me punishing myself. But it has been so difficult. But especially in these moments where nothing will run you more ragged than grief. Nothing. But the fact of the matter is, when you take away nourishment, when you take away fluids, when you take away sleep, if you think it's bad, it will only get worse. You will only make the situation where if you think you can't take more, if you don't eat, if you don't sleep, if you don't, get your fluids, it'll get worse. So if you're already at a mercy, just remind yourself, you still got to eat. You still got to
It's
sleep.
so
You
important
still
because
got to.
yeah, people don't realize that food, unfortunately, most people have conversations about food on how to stop eating,
Mm,
things like that. But sometimes people forget that nourishment helps with mood management, our ability to reason, our ability to regulate our emotions and to see things clearly. That is not just a mental thing, but like again, my body, I'm a hypermobile person who has a very unstable pelvis. Like dance feels so good, and that's a drug sometimes. So like if you're not nourishing, my reasoning and my ability to see the dangers were no longer there. So when I was in class feeling absolutely amazing, it's like tearing the chicken leg, like I didn't even notice the pain. I knew something happened when I couldn't move the leg anymore. It was kind of moving. It's it's amazing how important that is, and I know better. It wasn't that I didn't want to eat, I didn't even know I wasn't eating
Right.
because my focus was so much on that. So I'm sorry, one more thing. You asked advice to someone who's grieving. I think my greatest advice would be to someone who is witnessing someone
Mm.
grieving,
Mhm.
because that's where the healing begins. It's not the person in grief. They're always
Right.
telling the person who's either being traumatized or grieving or injured, you should fix yourself. When
Right.
how about the people who are witnessing someone in grief saying something as simple as like, tell me what not to do? Because that gives somebody agency. Because if you tell somebody, tell me what you want, more than likely, at least 50% of the people you ask that of are not going to want to put anybody out.
Mhm.
Say, tell me what not to do. They want to give you an answer because they're probably a people pleaser. So they're like, whoa, no one's ever asked me what I don't want. That can give one extra breath of agency, confidence, and just a refuel, a little bit of nourishment there. And if they go, I don't know what I don't want right now, reaffirm that with them. Just go, hey, at least you know that you don't know what you want. So reassurance, agency, don't try to impose and don't tell about your story while someone's in active grief. That is like the worst thing. Or ask something as simple as like, well, was this person that important to you? Like imagine with your friend, Matthew, well, who was he? Like, I didn't know him. You never talked about him. I
Mhm.
had some people say, well, I didn't even know you had a brother. Well, because my brother and I kept our social media completely separate because our whole lives we lived in we shared the same bedroom until we were 12 and 13. So we talked on the phone all the time and texted. He was be on the toilet, he'd be texting me. But we didn't have to share that on social media. So to have people go, oh, were you and your brother even close?
Mm. Right, like people want to feel it out. That's for their own anxiety, right? How anxious should I be about this person's loss?
Right.
Can I feel the relief right now if she says that we're not that close? Because if she says they aren't, I'm going to immediately feel a little better that she's not maybe suffering as much.
We can understand that stepping back from it, but while someone's in the
Oh
process of
no.
grieving,
Yeah.
that is traumatizing to them. It could be a pick of the scab and a little bit of
Mhm.
salt and
Mhm.
lime with no margarita. So yeah, so the advice would be to the people witnessing someone grieving, offer space to them. If you don't know what to say, I have no idea what to say. But if you want to tell me anything you don't want me to do, let me know. If there's anything you do want and you think I can, I'll try my best. Don't make promises that you can't keep.
Mhm.
And it's okay if you also can't hold space for someone grieving. And that's another thing too, is that I also had to understand everybody also processes the witnessing of grief differently. Some people will completely just leave you alone because it is scary. So yeah. My biggest advice is talk to people like you in
Oh
spaces
my
like
god.
but I'm like saying like this, like these podcasts talk about grief. It's a normal process of life. We're all going to lose something. Again, pets, our car. Like, oh my God, people. I have people who've grieved their car getting crashed. I cried when my car was donated to Channel Islands Restoration because that car and we went on adventures like you wouldn't believe, and no one wanted to buy it because it was a stick shift and I couldn't drive a stick anymore because of my hip. I mean, so
Oh,
you get.
Melissa, I love my car. I've had it since 2004. I call it the Phoenix because she has risen from the ashes through a car accident, through multiple break-ins, through being stolen. Like I
It was
trust. Oh
stolen.
yes. Oh yes. Like I get very attached to things as well, and it's really hard for me to let go of those.
Right? LA
Yes.
people, we get. I mean, that's like a pet. It's better than
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
We've prayed to our cars, just get me to the gas station.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, thank you, Jillian.
Melissa, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast and lending your
Mhm.
expertise. I'm so happy to have you back. I always love hearing your point of view. You're so healing as a person to just talk to and have around. You've been incredibly supportive to me throughout the whole Gray Maybe journey. And
Amazing.
on top of that, with the passing of my father, you've always done and said the right things and check in, all that. So I thank you so much for being here and everything you bring to the table.
I love you, Miss Jillian. Thank you.
I love
Oh.
you too. Thank you so much. What a gift to have Melissa back on Gray Maybe. I love how she honored all the different types of grief in our conversation. So much of what she talked about I relate to personally. Melissa is just one of those people who just gets it. It doesn't matter really what it is either. You just know she's going to get it. I really appreciate how gracefully Melissa navigates things, especially her own personal losses, including traumatic loss that also carries PTSD. I can't thank her enough for her service and sharing her process and journey here. If you're listening to this episode and you're experiencing grief, welcome, and I hope this helps your journey. You're not alone. Just a reminder for anyone who needs to hear it, you don't need to have experienced a giant catastrophic event or a death to experience grief. Know that whatever you're feeling, there are those among us who have probably felt it too. You're not alone. If you're listening and you have someone you love in your life that is grieving, welcome. You are also not alone. We as a society have a long way to go in being able to tolerate and help those closest to us manage grief. I've included a link in the show notes for the do's and don'ts, which I'm going to read here. Don't assign positive meaning to their loss. In our effort to encourage and support the griever, we may try to project the current situation into a better future way too soon. Saying, "Time will heal all things," is not helpful. Prophesizing a future positive meaning on top of the grieving person's crushing and devastating loss tends to minimize the griever's current agony, essentially suggesting that they sweep their pain under the rug while focusing on some potential positive long-term outcome. Stay in the moment with the griever. Follow the grieving person's lead. Be an attentive, active listener. Allow the griever to take the conversation where it needs to go. Make room for plenty of silence. Don't jump in to fill space with unnecessary commentary. Sometimes, before a two-way conversation can even begin, the griever just wants someone to sit with, literally or virtually. No questions or words of comfort are needed to fill silence. Presence is often what the griever really needs. On their own, sometimes the grieving person will identify a silver lining or hopeful thought that adds meaning to their loss. This is a normal and often constructive way to cope with grief. Remember, the griever is the only person who can know what this loss means to them. Only the griever can make meaning of their experience. Once they do so, it's appropriate to support them in their newfound hope. Use the name of the lost loved one. While you are comforting the griever, all of their emotions are tied up in the loss of their beloved. Saying their loved one's name out loud is a way of validating the life of that person. Say Anne, not your sister. Say Alan, not your son. Say Stu, not your husband. Don't ever be afraid to mention the person lost. Grievers want to talk. Memories are all that remain after a loss, and talking about the person who died helps to keep them alive in broken hearts. Refrain from platitudes. Refrain from platitudes, religious or otherwise, like, "They are in a better place," or "Time heals all things," or "Everything happens for a reason." Don't pretend that you know the answer. You don't. No one does. As a person who desires to support a griever, pay attention to what you say. Never say anything that starts with the phrase, "at least." Comparing and contrasting your own grief experiences or dreamed up hypothetical ones with the reality of the loss that just happened is missing the mark in several ways. Making your loss the topic of conversation is asking the grieving person to switch their focus and empathize with your grief at a time when the total focus should be on them. Don't say, "I know how you feel." You don't. Seems to me describing how something worse could have happened represents a thwarted attempt to say something, no matter how unhelpful. Stay out of your empty word, ill-informed autopilot script. Choose not to go there. Be open to the expression of any emotion. As an active listener, be open to any emotions the griever may express through verbal or nonverbal means. Anger, yelling, silence, rage, disbelief, denial, crying, pacing around the room, shouting, rocking back and forth, wringing hands, clenched fists, avoiding eye contact, needing to be held, avoiding touch, etc. Be observant about what the griever is expressing, overt or subtle, and allow a safe space to be in that moment. Do not in any way tell them not to feel what they are feeling. Remember anniversaries. Try to remember anniversaries such as the birthday of the person who died and the anniversary of the date of their death. Sending a card or a text will let the griever know that you are remembering too, reminding them that they are not alone. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you were able to find something relatable in today's episode. If you'd like to show your support for this podcast, consider making a donation on Spotify. It would also be very helpful if you could rate, share, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to contact the podcast, please email graymaybestories@gmail.com, graymaybestories@gmail.com. Thank you to everyone who helped make this Gray Maybe podcast happen. Producer and editor, Roderick Barge. Cover photo by Jose Perez. Music licensed by Pixabay. Special counsel, Jada Ellingham and Roderick Barge. Special shout out to supporter Patty Olgan. Until next time, bye for now.